Good afternoon. Hey, I'm Richard Alker with Total Practice Solutions Group, and we've got a discussion panel here today to talk about the state of the market in the veterinary practice sales and appraisal business. So today with me, I've got Dr. Lynn Jones, who had been in private practice for 18 years, and then been in the practice sales and valuation side of the business for the last 21 years, and was actually the founder of Total Practice Solutions Group. We've also got Dr. Kurt Lilsberg, who had practiced in private practice for about 21 years, and had been in the practice sales business for the last 21 years. So glad to have my colleagues with me today. And what we're going to do is go through some questions and some answers on what's going on in the market in the veterinary industry as far as practice sales and as it relates to buyers and sellers both. So first question we've got for Dr. Jones is, what do you see as the biggest change in the market in the last year? We've had a lot of changes over the last year. What are you seeing in relation to the market that affects buyers and sellers that you're seeing?
Well, of course, the biggest change has been the pullback from the consolidators. We noticed this starting to happen probably along October, maybe was when we first started seeing some of this, but it's been a dramatic, as far as we can tell, it's been a pretty dramatic cutoff from the number of consolidators that are out there actively buying practices. At the peak of it, we had probably 60 consolidators. In today's market, there's probably 4 to 5 that are actually actively buying practices at this time. So that's been a huge pullback. And, we saw it coming. We knew that it couldn't sustain with the prices that were being paid. But I don't think anybody realized it would be such a dramatic turnoff. But in today's market, there's very little activity from the consolidators. And with rising interest rates, that's been some of their issues. Cost of capital. Another big issue for them is being able to find doctors to staff the hospitals that they own. And so with that dual thing there, dual problems, both of those have created the market conditions that we're in today. And none of the consolidators that bought practices were planning on keeping them primarily. There's a few that probably were, but most of them were planning on selling to another platform. And at this point in time, those platforms have not developed, and there's not many buyers out there that want to buy these bigger platforms. So I think we're going to see a further glut as we go further as far as the consolidators' activity. Also, with rising interest rates, we've seen a little bit of a pullback. We saw a little bit of a rise in interest from private buyers the last half of 2022, and then so far 2023, we've had a lot of inquiries on solo doctor, 2-doctor practices that would be interesting to an individual buyer. But again, interest rates have sort of cooled that market a little bit as well.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Dr. Jones. Dr. Lilsberg, although we're not technically in a recession right now, do you see any resemblance in the market today compared to what we saw in 2010, 2011, and 2012, and during that recessionary time?
Yes, Dr. Alker, but I think we have to look at 3 things. What was the economy and practice like right before the crash, and then after the crash, and then similarities with today? So prior to the crash, practices were doing very well, and we had a very large shortage of doctors. Just like today. Doctors were being paid very well. I had some owners at the time tell me basically associates were writing their own contracts, and the owners were agreeing to anything just to get them into their practice. Then after the crash, practice revenues dropped. Owners' retirement plans dropped. Practice valuations, the practice value dropped because of revenue. So a lot of owners were not going to market, and a lot of marginal associates were let go after the crash. So right after the crash, we had a lot of practice buyers and very small amount of inventory because the owners wanted to hold those practices. They were a little worried about money, retirement plans were down, and their practice values were down. So it was a bit of a seller's market back then because there wasn't a lot of doctors willing to sell. Today, we have a mixture of both things that happened prior to the crash and after the crash. Practices are doing very well, just like they were prior to the crash. There's also a doctor shortage today, which we had prior to the crash. So doctors are getting paid fairly large salaries and large signing bonuses to stay on. So that is the same. The thing that's different today from after the crash is we have a lot of practices and inventory to sell from retiring baby boomers. And with the doctor shortage and these associate doctors making very good money today, we do have a shortage of buyers. So it's opposite. Right after the crash, we had a lot of buyers, few practices. Today, we have a lot of practices for sale and not as many buyers. So I think it's a combination of all of those things. It is a unique market. And after the crash, we came back into equilibrium for buyers and sellers in 2012. Equilibrium, we have the right amount of practices for sale with the right amount of buyers looking. So today we are a little lopsided, more practices than buyers.
All right. Great information. Lynn, have you got anything to add to what you saw back in 2010 and 11 compared to what we're seeing now? Or do you think Dr. Lewis pretty well covered that? You got any additional comments on that?
I think he pretty well covered it. Practices were in situations where, a lot of associates got let go back in those days because the owners were struggling to make the practice profitable. And so, that was one thing that we used as a selling tool back then. Hey, own your own practice. And then that won't happen to you. But in today's market, these companies are paying so much salary that a lot of these veterinarians think, well, gosh, I can make more and work less working at a corporate practice than I can owning my own practice, which is really not true. I mean, you can make a lot more money if you own your practice, and that's what we're trying to relay to people. And we'll get into, I think one of the questions coming is about interest rates, maybe. So, yeah, I fully agree with Dr. Losberg.
Great. All right. So interest rates have been going up for almost a year now. They've been at historic low levels for many, many years in the 3 and 4% area. They're running, mid 5s to mid 6s now. So talk a little bit about how those current interest rates are affecting the buying market, the selling market. How are individual buyers looking at that? And maybe how should they look at it compared to historical numbers back when you and I started practice? We were paying 15 to 18% for money. So give us some insight on what you think how you think that's going to affect things going forward here in the near future.
Interest rates are a big factor in this game. And when somebody looks at buying a practice, interest rates are something that everybody wants the cheapest rate. And we've got a generation that has come along as new business owners that were in that 3 and 4% era. And they don't remember anything higher than that. So it's really scary for them. But so far, I don't think the interest rate has been a big factor in the lack of buyers. I think it's more just a situation with not enough veterinarians and a lot of them not wanting the headaches of ownership. But as interest rates rise, I think we will see that more and more buyers are worried about those rates. And for us, the valuation work that we're doing right now, we have to take into account the higher cost of money And so valuations have come down some on especially a 1 or 2 doctor practice, because if somebody's got to go get financing for that practice, it's going to cost them more money, which in effect lowers the valuation. But a lot of it is a mental game. We try to tell people, hey, don't worry about what the interest rates are. You're going to make more money as an owner, and the business is going to pay the payment. And so if the practice is priced right, it's still a good opportunity for somebody, regardless of the interest rate. And that's the message we try to get across to our buyers.
Perfect. And I think the other side of that is that interest rates aren't going to stay high forever. I mean, we can't predict the future, but what we're expecting is that these interest rates will probably trickle back down in the next 2 to 3 years, and will offer a refinancing opportunity for these on these loans 2 to 3 years down the road, where they can get back to what they might consider more of a normal interest rate down the road. So, Dr. Lilsberg, with most corporate consolidators kind of in a buying pause, as Dr. Jones mentioned earlier, and given the current economic conditions, how are you seeing these situations affecting the values of practices, say a typical 1 to 2 doctor practice, when you're doing valuations on it?
Well, I think it's bringing everything back to where it was 6, 7, 8 years ago, when over 95% of our sales were to private buyers. There were a lot less corporations back then. The corporations were paying dollars that were slightly above market value prices, but not crazy. And the buyers were working owners. They were paying fair market value prices. They were not inflated prices. And the real estate went with the sale. Unlike when the corporations were buying them, most of them preferred to lease the real estate and leave the sellers with a little bit of risk. So it's where we were 6, 7, 8 years ago, where there were a few major player corporations paying slightly above market value prices, because multiples have come down today. And we're selling to private working buyers that become part of the community.
Okay. Perfect. So let's get into a little bit about what we can recommend to buyers and sellers with the current market conditions. So, Dr. Jones, with what we've talked about, what do you feel like are the top 2 to 3 recommendations you'd have for a seller that's thinking about selling right now?
Well, we have a lot of people in that boat of, hey, I missed the boat. I missed it. And a lot of them did, unfortunately. But there are people that are ready to retire. We have the conversation yesterday with a lady that, she's ready to retire. She realized she missed the boat, but she's willing to take less for quality of life. So we've taken each case individually, but primarily we're recommending that if you're not just burnt out and you want to walk out the door, we're recommending you might need to hold on to this practice a couple of more years. And during that time, some of the other recommendations are, let's see what your finances look like now and see if we can fix that. So when there is a little bit better market condition, you have a lot more sellable product. And so we're doing some valuation work where we're making recommendations of how to make sure the practice is profitable. There's usually 2 reasons it's not profitable. One of those is the staff cost, which we've seen staff costs go up fairly significantly in most practices. To retain staff, people are having to pay them more. One of the other things we're noticing is primarily a lot of the owners are not keeping up with current increases in medical drugs and medical supply costs, and those costs have gone up significantly. And some of the people that we're dealing with have not realized those increased costs. And so they're actually losing money in some instances on their product sales. So we're trying to help them make sure they keep their inventory current, their inventory marked up at the current market conditions for inventory sales. And so far, most of the practices we've seen this year where we've done evaluation work, their cost of goods have gone up 3 to 6% over what they were previously. And so that's something that we've had several people say, well, I can't charge that much for these drugs. And my comment is, if you don't charge it, you're subsidizing, because you're going to pay for it if you don't want the client to pay for it. And I do understand that costs have significantly increased, but you still have to maintain some level of profitability with your margins. And then staff costs, again, going back to that, that's something we're seeing a 2 to 4% increase in people's staff cost. And that's retaining staff. It's just costing us more. So we have to pass that along to the consumer. And I don't know any other way around that. But that's something that a lot of people are not keeping up with, and they really need to start managing their practices a little bit better to get a better return when the market does become a better situation.
Yeah, correct. I think we've seen, the same thing. We've seen cost of goods in practices in the 35 to 40% range, which is just not sustainable for the practice, and certainly seeing staff costs increase on those doctors we're working with. So, Dr. Losberg, same question. Given the current market, what would be your top 2 to 3 recommendations for buyers for veterinarians that are looking to buy a practice right now?
Rich, I think one of the first things I would recommend for buyers to understand that they can own a practice and still balance career and family. We have a lot of practice owners right now that we're talking to about selling, that they are jumping on this work-life balance. A lot of these practices are only open 4 days a week. We're seeing sellers closing them down at 5 o'clock in the evening. They're not working Saturdays anymore. They're not taking emergencies anymore. So I think they have already established a 35 to 40 hour work week life balance, that they're not working 55 hours a week, where a buyer thinks, I don't think I should get into this because that's not what I want. The sellers are already doing that. Not all those sellers are boomers. We have doctors in their 50s that are doing it. So they can buy a practice, even work it 4 days a week, and still make appropriate owner income, which, if it's priced right, like Dr. Jones talked about earlier, they will make more money and have more control over their career. So that's the first thing. The other thing that I would tell buyers, today is a bit of a buyer's market. We have more practices and inventory to sell than we have buyers looking, although we are seeing an uptick in buyers also in the Great Lakes. So if you want to own, this may be a great time to own a practice, because you can maybe get in on a good deal on some of these. As far as the interest rates holding you back, don't let that bother you. Mid 5s, low 6s only seems really high when you're comparing it to 3.5% to 4%. It wasn't all that long ago. I think 10, 12 years ago, we were routinely writing practice loans at 8, 9%. So the 6% interest rate, 6.5%, it's okay. It is still below prime. Prime interest rate right now is 8%. So you can still get financed for commercial paper for 1.5 points below prime. Commercial paper used to be priced above prime. It is still a good value. So that, I think, is important to buyers, to put it in relative terms, that they can balance their life, own the practice. This is a good time to come in at a good deal, and the interest rates are not ridiculously out of line.
Great. All right. Well, we're close to being out of time here today. But Dr. Jones, you got any final comments as we wrap up on anything that maybe we're not going to cover every topic related to veterinary practice sales today. But have you got any final comments as we wrap up?
I would think a summary would be for sellers, if you're willing to work another year or two, grind in, figure out where your practice weaknesses are, get those straightened out, and then prepare to sell in the next 1 to 2 years. For buyers, there's never been a better time, as like Logeberg said. I think that there's a lot of good quality practices out there, and it's a great time. Interest rates are probably going to go a little higher, but disregard what those interest rates are and go ahead and get into ownership. You won't regret it.
Dr. Logeberg, any final comments from you?
Well, I agree with everything that Dr. Jones has said. Practice ownership, when I owned 20, for that 20 years, always treated me well and my family. And I think it can treat all the young doctors that are purchasing. It can be very good for their families also.
Great. Thank you too for taking your time today. This is the first of a series of webinars that we're going to publish on the state of the market. So look for the for new ones to come out in the future. If you have any questions, you can go to our website at totalpracticesolutionsgroup.com. Get in touch with any of our brokers. Be glad to help you out. Be glad to answer any of your questions in the future. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Alker.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Alker.